In the first volume of J.R.R. Tolkien's epic, The Lord of the Rings, entitled The Fellowship of the Ring, as the novel is drawing to a close, the company of the Fellowship is leaving the enchanted elvish forest known as Lothlorien and taking their leave of the elvish princess, Lady Galadriel. As each one takes their leave of Galadriel, she bestows upon them a gift. And those gifts are a foreshadowing of heroism or tasks that are yet to come for each member of the Fellowship. Legolas, an elf who is skilled with a bow, was given an elvish bow of particular power. Samwise Gamgee, who is the companion of Frodo Baggins, but also is particularly astute at gardening, is given an enchanted herb that he uses later to replenish the desecrated Shire, and a bit of elvish rope that becomes very useful to them on their quests. The other hobbits, Peregrine Took and Meriadoc Brandybuck, also known as Merry and Pippin, are given daggers, indicating later heroism in battle that they will eventually carry out. Gimli, a dwarf who has a particular loathing for elves, is so taken by Galadriel that the only gift he asks for is one strand of her golden hair, and she gives him 3. To Frodo Baggins, she gives him a vial, not of any liquid or solid or any gaseous product, but just light. Light of Elendil, their most precious star. And she says, let this be a light that shines when all other lights go out. And in the most darkest moments of Frodo's task, he pulls out the vial of the light of Elendil and it lights his way, even in the midst of a darkness of spirit that he has as he continues his quest. We see things like this in all sorts of stories of heroism, of mythology, and we hear of it in today's story of Jesus. I always like to refer to the story of the Magi, which we refer to as the Epiphany, as the sobering side or the darker side of the Christmas message. While we're very enamored and happy with the story of the birth of Jesus, the story of the Magi, the event of the Epiphany, and its aftermath is not a happy story. It's actually a very tragic one. It pulls us from the euphoria of the joy of the birth of Christ back down to earth to remember the effect that this child has on everyone's life, every follower, and down through history. And not even Mary was spared that, because the, I guess you could say, Epiphany story of the Gospel of Luke would be the presentation, whereas Simeon takes the child in his arms and on the one hand gives praise to God for fulfilling his word that he would not die until he saw the Messiah, to a very foreboding prophecy directed at Mary, in which he said that this child will be the downfall and the rise of many in Israel, a sign that will be violently opposed. The thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and even Mary's heart would be dissected, run through by a sword. Not even Mary would be spared the effect that this child will have. In the Gospel of Matthew is where we find the story of the wise men. We refer to them as the 3 wise men, but it's one of those more amusing trivia points on this story, in that we don't know how many wise men there were. It just says, Magi from the east came. But it says they gave their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and so our tradition has 3 wise men, and by our tradition we even give them names, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. Even though the scriptures themselves don't give us their names or their number, we do have the 3 gifts that they give. And even in those gifts, just as in the case of the Lady Galadriel to the Fellowship of the Ring, and in other stories in which notable figures give the hero a gift that is a foreshadowing of things to come, so too do the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh give a sobering foreshadowing of what this child is and who this child will grow up to be. It begins with the gift of gold, which for us in California, let's face it, if we know our history in California, gold is something we perhaps take for granted. We had the gold rush here in California. What's the motto of California? Eureka, meaning I found it. And what was the big boost with the gold rush in California? You can wash gold out of your socks every night. In other words, the common person can strike it rich coming to California searching for gold. But at the time of Christ, gold was not something that the common person possessed. The royalty possessed the gold. The royalty had the gold. And so in giving gold to this child, there was an indication, an inspired indication and a recognition of this child as a king. The Gospel of Matthew begins with the genealogy of Jesus, which we read every Christmas Eve at the Vigil Mass, which includes the genealogy of Jesus as a child in the family line of David, and who held the kingship in Israel. And now a foreign nation, foreign emissaries, are placing gold before this child, who would restore and carry on eternally the rule of King David. We have the gift of frankincense. We all know what frankincense is, don't we? Frankincense is that smoky stuff that priests like to use to make us cough because he hates us and wants to make us miserable. But if you look in the book of Exodus, just 2 chapters before the people fall into sin with the golden calf, God actually gives a recipe and an instruction in the law on frankincense, declaring it to be sacred to the Lord. That is not to be burned in the home or used in any other way except in the worship of God. Fast forward to the Gospel according to Luke, the very beginning of the Gospel, we see Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, going into the temple to offer sacrifice. But what is the sacrifice he's offering? He is burning incense. And it is to the right of the altar of incense, perhaps within the smoke of the incense itself, Gabriel makes his appearance and his annunciation to Zechariah about the birth of John the Baptist. And we continue to use incense as a directive from God in our worship of Almighty God. When I first came across that passage in Exodus, to me it was actually a very powerful indication when we come together, and especially on solemnities and special feasts such as today. Keep this in mind, folks. Whenever we use incense, it's not about you. It's not even about me, who gets a full blast of it. It's about the worship of God. And God instructs us to use incense in our worship. Just be grateful you're not Orthodox Christians who use it in everything, every Sunday, for 3 hours all year round. I once had a young 6th grader in one of the schools I worked with who was Russian Orthodox, and I said, "You must be very traditional." He says, "Very traditional, very old, ancient liturgy." I said, "Which means you don't use incense for anything." He says, "We use it for everything." And I went, "Really?" Looking at all the Catholic members of his class. But when we use incense, it is in honor of God. And when incense was presented to this child, it was an inspired recognition of the divine nature of this child in the manger. Then we have myrrh, which is perhaps the most sobering of the 3 gifts that were presented. Many people often question, what is myrrh? If you remember Garrison Keillor and his A Prairie Home Companion out of Minnesota, in his story of the wise men, he says that shows you that the wise person was actually a good Lutheran. He said myrrh was a hot dish. He said gold and frankincense, they're probably hungry. Here, give them this myrrh, just make sure they return the pan. But myrrh, in fact, is an ointment for the embalming of a dead body. Not the most optimistic of gifts to give to a newborn child. One might say, well, you know, the infant mortality rate, we want to be careful and be ready just in case. But these 3 men also gave gold and frankincense. But this myrrh is a very sobering foreshadowing of what this child will do when he grows up. This child will grow up to be betrayed, condemned, and crucified. Myrrh slingshots us through the entire gospel straight to the crucifixion. Perhaps the last thing we want to think of in the celebration of Christmas, but just think about it. The star is not described in the Gospel of Matthew. But whenever we see illustrations of the star, how is that star shaped? What's one distinctive feature of the star? And that is the longer tail. In other words, in illustrations of the star, it's in the shape and form of the cross. The cross is always in mind in the images of Jesus in the manger. And so we have a very sobering story that rounds out the story of the birth of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew. And of course, we know the aftermath of the visit of the Magi, the wrath of King Herod, the slaughter of the innocents, the flight into Egypt. A tragic story, but again, reflective of the effect that this child will have, bringing us with our euphoria and joy in the birth of Christ right back down to earth as a reminder of our call as his followers. Epiphany means revelation, and this is what is revealed to us. This child is a king. This child is the Son of God. This child will die on the cross, and this child will be an upheaval for all those, whether they embrace him as his followers or not. Let us recognize that Epiphany in this last feast of our Christmas season. Let it also be our call as his followers, that as we rejoice in the birth of Jesus and look forward to the eventual celebration of his resurrection later on this year, let us resolve now to be his faithful followers. In whatever upheaval that would be in our lives, whatever conversion we are constantly called to engage in to be more authentically his followers, let us with those wise men recognize the revelation that God has given us through this event in the story of the birth of Christ.